All right, well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the American Institute for Philosophical and Cultural Thought. My name is John Shook, and I'm the president. We have the other two directors of the Institute here with us, Randall Auxier and Larry Hickman. Welcome, good to see you. The American Institute for Philosophical and Cultural Thought fosters the study of philosophical and cultural thought in America, and we collect. This is an archive and a library. We provide access to these resources to all sorts of visiting researchers, both domestic from here in America and international around the world. We have approximately 25 to 30,000 books, we're not clear, under this one roof, and collections of papers as well. And we can host workshops and seminars like this one tonight fairly frequently. This space is also available for various kinds of receptions and musical events and other sorts of events of interest to the community and the academic community nearby at the Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. We also have a resident fellowship program. Do we have any fellows here with us presently?
There are a bunch of fellows here. Paul's a fellow, Myron's a fellow, Jared's a fellow.
Paul Cherlin. Myron Jackson is here with us, so good to see you folks. We believe that this institute has opened and is operating at a crucial time for humanities in America. There is a growing neglect for the humanities across institutions of higher education in America, and there is a widespread tendency, we worry, to neglect humanistic learning in our culture, and we fear that it's getting worse and worsening. So we are in defiance of that pessimism here. This is an act of bold optimism. And so we decided to create a home, a community for humanistic thinking and learning, and we are devoted to conserving and conveying that treasure of inherited values and achievements on into the future. So we're glad to have you here, and we regard events such as these as a very good sign that there remains to be continued interest in humanistic thought, philosophical thought, and American culture. It is still alive and well, and we can treasure it and pass it on. So the next person who is going to speak is Randall Auxier, who will do some further introductions. Thank you very much for being here.
Right. This is a cookie. This cookie was paid for by the Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity. In addition to this cookie, however, the Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity has sponsored this spring conference for creativity, and in particular this year's spring conference. This is the first year. We're going to do it for at least 3 years, but possibly beyond that, was creativity, pragmatism, and logic. And so we've had an afternoon of papers on the topics of creativity, pragmatism, and logic. And the Central Society for the Philosophy of Creativity, which is being restarted as of this evening with this ceremonial cookie, is going to be having a spring conference every year here. The Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity has partnered with the AIPCT for lots of different programming, including a summer dissertation fellowship. The first one was this past year. We've got another one coming up this summer, and that has been a very successful program. The Hahn Lectures, the fourth of which was this past summer, and the fifth one will be this next summer. Ken Stickers will be our Hahn lecturer, and I look forward to a full day of activities associated with that. And on into the future, the Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity intends to interact with AIPCT and to promote the study of creativity, especially the philosophical study of creativity. Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity and its associated societies, Pacific Division, Eastern Division, this one, was started in 1957 by William S. Minor, who was a professor of communication studies at SIU, a rhetoric professor essentially, but the philosophy of communication was his specialty. And those societies have carried out important research and have facilitated important research now for 62 years. And so we intend to continue that, and we intend to continue it here. And so it's natural, given that the foundation and these societies were started at SIU Carbondale, that they should continue to be based here and continue to do their programming here. So with that said, we have had a research fellow here for the 2018-19 academic year, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Larry Hickman to introduce tonight's speaker, who is our resident fellow for 2018-2019 at the AIPCT.
Well, it's a real pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Professor David Beisecker, also known as Dave, as you can see from the screen there. Dave received his BA degree from Washington University in St. Louis, his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh under the direction of Robert Brandom, a very well-known philosopher indeed. He has been at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas for, I count, 21 years. That's approximately.
Except for this year.
21 years. And he has published a number of articles in journals and book chapters. His work in journals include those published in the Transactions of the Charles Peirce Society, the Journal for the History of Analytical Philosophy, Southwest Philosophical Studies, and many others. I should mention that for those among you who may be fans of the TV series The Walking Dead, that Dave has published papers on zombies, and I'm sure that he'd be very happy to speak with you after the meeting, after his talk. The title of his talk, as you can see here, is Bilateral Logic and the Pragmatic Maxim. Please welcome Dave Beisecker.
Thanks indeed. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I just want to make sure that I need to convey how grateful I am to the AIPCT for giving me the opportunity to spend this glorious year here in southern Illinois. It's been, some of you know, it's been quite productive for me. It's also been wonderfully rejuvenating, and so this year has been one that I will treasure and remember forever. And so thanks to the directors, I'm glad all of you are here, in fact, to celebrate, actually, this thing with me. I'm going to give you, we have this conjoint conference with the philosophy for creativity, and in some degree, I think maybe you might want to apply your creative juices to try to figure out what this talk will have to do with the philosophy of creativity. Now, I will give you some hints there along the way. I am going to. This is a very it's a fearsome title, I suppose, and perhaps a little bit. Perhaps a little bit off the regular run of events here at the AIPCT, but I don't think I don't think you'll find it too fearsome. And in fact, I hope you'll get from it some of the deep cares that I have about logic, and especially its pedagogy. Now, what I plan to do. There's my little girl here who's been spending time with me at the AIPC2. My plan is going to be to introduce an easy-to-learn logical proof system. In fact, one that is so easy and mechanical, I hope one of the messages that I convey to you is that you should all adopt it in your various courses on in Introduction to Logic. It's something that, frankly, you can introduce to logic students in the course of one class period, and they can go and perform proofs, derivations of sequence, that's basically of arguments, that takes, in more standard systems, weeks to master. I will note one of the features of this proof system, namely its bilaterality. And then I will relate this feature to articulations of the pragmatic maxim, especially articulations that Peirce give. And then I will perhaps, if time permitting, wrap this up and step back and sort of take a look at some larger pictures as to how, even by looking at a system of proof, how that might reconceive and modify our conceptions of really the central notions that animate, that give life to logic. Well, let me start again with a particular hero of mine who is not known to be a pragmatist. It's actually Lewis Carroll, and this kind of tells you my abiding interest and passion for logical pedagogy. Lewis Carroll, who of course was not only the author of Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, he was also a mathematician and logician at Oxford, and he bemoaned of the current state of logic texts. This is the state of the art in the 1880s and 1890s. He bemoaned the state of the current logic texts, complaining that they delivered a minimal of results after a maximum expenditure of effort. Now, for those of you who have had traumatic experiences in your logic courses, perhaps as your first course as an undergraduate, you might have kind of felt the same way, that we have these complicated texts, and what are we getting out of them? What's the point? When will I use this ever again? And so on. These are two of Carroll's texts himself. Now, the first connection to creativity. In Volume 2 of his Symbolic Logic, or actually for Volume 2 of his Symbolic Logic, Carroll wrote in his diary in 1894, he had one of these creative moments, these flashes of genius, and he describes this: "Today has proved to be an epoch in my logical work. It occurred to me to try a, let's see, big hairy logic problem by a new method," and he took a big hairy logic problem and applied this method that he developed, and it came out beautifully, and he decided to call it the genealogical method there in his diaries, but it becomes known as Lewis Carroll's method of trees. I will not parse these out, but this is what a proof via Carroll's method of trees comes to be. And you can see in this is a precursor to a relatively well-known method right now called the method of semantic trees, or the method of truth trees, or semantic tableau. So this is a descendant of Lewis Carroll's method. It was actually developed independently. There's a story there. Lewis Carroll's method was actually lost to history for about 90 years. This is the method of trees developed by Richard Jeffrey and popularized in his 1967 text. And what happens here is we start by listing premises of what you might think of as an argument, but logicians will call them more generally sequence. Then you negate the conclusion, and then you work out the consequences by using rules that you apply onto the major operators of your premises and your negated conclusion. And so this is what this looks like. Now, here's a place where you might pause, stop and pause. I am going to present what might be thought of as a notational variant on Richard Jeffrey's method of trees. And it's a very simple notational variant, and you might wonder, how has it been since 1967 nobody has published this notational variant? This is now, it had been sort of floating around a little bit, but it was developed, and actually now it's published this month by my colleague and former student Jesse Fitz and myself in 2019. And if you recall, the Richard Jeffrey method of trees starts by listing premises and then negating a conclusion. Our method, the bilateral method of trees, starts simply by listing premises on the left, and instead of negating a conclusion, just listing the conclusion on the right. So for example, here's something that one might want to put on a tree. Think of that as a premise, and now think of that as a conclusion. And you might see that this is a representation of one of the De Morgan's equivalencies. Now basically what the method specifies, has us do, is you take a look at the major operator of formulas, and you just apply the rule depending upon whether a formula appears on the right and the left. And you will notice that what the rules do is they decompose formulas down to their atomic and therefore unanalyzable components. Okay? Now, methods of trees, Richard Jeffrey's method said that you close a tree when you have a formula and its negation. You close a branch of a tree when you find a formula and its negation on that branch. And a completely closed tree says that it is impossible, in Richard Jeffrey's case. Let's see if we can get back here. Yes, we're back here. In the Jeffrey's case, what we're basically showing is that it is impossible to hold these premises true and this negation of a conclusion true. So they can't all be true at once. And that turns out to be, at least on some assumptions with sentential logic classically considered, that is equivalent to knowing that the premises can't be true and the conclusion false. All right. Well, in our variation, instead of branches closing when you have a formula and its negation, you have a branch close when you have some formula on the left and that same formula on the right. Okay? And now think about doing this with your Logic 114 class. You basically have them list formulas on the left or the right, and now they just blindly apply these rules. Now, of course, there's reasons that these rules are the way they are, but present them just as, well, this is what you do, present them as a game. And so, for instance, this is a negation of a conjunction. Ask yourself, what do you do with the negation of a conjunction on the left? Well, you just you strip that conjunction away, and you strip that negation away, and you put the conjunction on the right. Right? Now, what do you do with a disjunction on the right? Well, that happens to be one of these rules. A disjunction on the right, as you place both of the disjuncts, again, on the right. And we still have some complex formulas here. I'll talk about, I use this example for a reason, but we can go on. It turns out order won't matter for this. You might want to apply the non-branching rules before the branching rules, otherwise you'll end up with a kudzu bush, and those are kind of messy to deal with. But these are non-branching rules. This right here is a branching rule. So we'll apply these two negations on the right. The rule tells us when you have a negation on the right, just put that which is negated on the left. And Finally, we have the conjunction on the right. And the conjunction on the right rule is you split the branch that you're working on, and you put both of the conjuncts, one each, on the right. And then you notice as you look up a path, you have a B here, an atomic formula B on the right. You have an atomic formula B on the left. That closes. You have an atomic formula here, A, on the right, an atomic formula here, A, on the left. That closes. And if a tree completely closes, you may be said to have a proof from your premises, if there are more than one, or your premise here, to the conclusion. And that's all you need. Okay? But notice, by the way, that this is a purely formal method. I have not said anything at all about what the various, I said conjunction, and I probably should have said ampersand. And I could use you talk about these things as if they're arrows or wedges. But it's a purely formal system. You could teach, well, the point is you can teach a computer how to do this. But if you can teach a computer how to do this, then you can teach your undergraduates how to do it as well. And the point being is within half an hour, you can get rather complex, this is just the same thing, rather complex proofs. Just have them decompose the formulas down, and you can see that if actually there is an entailment, you will have a proof. And again, order won't matter, unlike natural deduction systems. And so within a relatively short time, you can get mastery of this proof system, okay? Without telling them why the proof system works. That's another task. And so here we have a couple more examples. Two premises, a conclusion. If you want to check my work, you can go ahead and do that right now. But here's another one, and I include this one because it has open paths. And one of the real great virtues of tree systems of logic, as opposed to especially natural deduction systems of logic, is if you have open paths that cannot be closed off, what you do is you can just look up a branch, look up a path, and by taking a look at whether atomic formulas are on the left or the right, you can construct a counterexample of the relevant symbolically framed argument. Okay, well, you can kind of go sort of step back. Okay, well, what does that mean? Is this really a proof system? This is a diagram from a recent article of mine. Again, you might think, look, why this is a kind of a simple, just a simple logical, a notational variant of the Jeffreys trees. One might wonder, why has it encountered such resistance to being more widely taught? And there's been some debate as to whether trees like that, things like these trees, really count as proofs. But here I want to notice, and this is just a diagram here from a recent paper of mine, what it basically points out is that you may conceive, actually you can see a close connection between the tree rules and rules of elimination and introduction in a natural deduction system. And so just taking a couple examples here, this is a natural deduction system. It says, what does it take to get a conjunction? Yeah, so what allows you to infer a conjunction? And that is, you need to be able to verify each of the conjuncts. Okay? simple conjunction introduction. The tree rules actually do not need to be understood as a side for falsity and a side for truth and a side for falsity. Instead, you can understand the tree rules here as giving us a goal side and a what you have side that will allow you to construct natural deduction proofs. So this basically says, hey, what does it take for you to prove what if you have a conjunction as a goal, then in order to achieve that goal, you need to achieve this as a goal and you need to achieve that as a goal as well. This, by the way, although it looks weird, is simply an application of modus ponens, or conditional elimination. It basically says, what can you do with a conditional? Well, if you were to get the antecedent as a goal, then you can make available to yourself the consequent. And that's basically what your typical conditional elimination rule tells you to do. Okay, so there is a nice tight connection between the left and the right hand rules for this system and the introduction and elimination rules in your standard natural deduction system. And that's basically, this is a slide that I have used for several purposes, but basically what it tells you is that if you are teaching logic, you can use the two-sided trees as guides for the construction of natural deduction proofs. Okay? This is often, this is one of the stumbling blocks in teaching introduction to formal logic, because these are so open-ended and order matters, and by comparison, the two-sided trees are purely mechanical and decompositional. And one of the things you can do in order to attain mastery of a system such as this is you can teach students how to line up the two-sided trees with natural deduction proofs. These are easy to do. These are much harder to construct. All right, well, you can go, what does this have to do with American philosophy? Okay, and I can see it in Randy's eyes. It's like, oh, we got this formal method. Oh, that's all very good. Why are you talking about that here? Well, I'm going to make a claim. I'm going to make a claim that Peirce would have perhaps appreciated, and I would think have adopted, a method such as this, would at least appreciate it. And one of the pieces of evidence that I would ask you to consider is this little snippet from On the Algebra of Logic in 1885. It's Peirce basically giving us an axiomatization of the propositional calculus, and he has 5 axioms. And as with any axiom system, okay, the first few axioms are pretty straightforward. It's the last one that seems to do all the work. And same for Peirce's axiomatization of sentential logic. He tells us this is the axiom. A 5th icon is required to, well, deliver all of the goods. And this is the schemata for the axiom. It's come to be known as Peirce's law. Look at it. Looks obvious to you, right? Well, Peirce says, well, this is hardly axiomatical. Of course, it's not. It's not obviously true. That it is true appears as follows. And now I'm going to go to the next slide. It can only be false by the final consequent being false while its antecedent is true. In other words, this reason why we should believe it to be true is it can be false only if the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. But if so, either it's, now there he's working on this side, either its consequent x is true, but that possibility is closed off by this, or the antecedent is false. Okay? But in the last case, if this is false under a classical understanding of the arrow, we again have the antecedent x being true, and that closes this off. By the way, this makes it also very patent why y doesn't matter. What y looks like doesn't matter. It doesn't figure in the closing of this proof. Now, by comparison, this is Peirce's law if you have to do it in your standard natural deduction system. That is, without derived rules and with pure introduction and elimination rules. One thing to notice is the proof of this is routed only through the rules of negation, even though this doesn't have negation built into it at all. That means, at least in this system, the system doesn't exhibit something called a separability problem. You have to sometimes route the proof of something using symbols that aren't within that very formula. If you look at the two-sided trees, that doesn't happen. Okay? Go back over here, we only had applications that of rules that pertained to conditionals only. This requires us to go through negations as well. And one of the reasons that is the case, if you're bored, by the way, go ahead and try to, without using derived rules, go ahead and prove this real quick with a standard natural deduction system. What's happening right here in this proof is there are lots of things happening on the right-hand side of the tree. That's what you might think of as the side of falsity. This action is recapitulated in this proof only by embedding in lots of negation, basically what are called refutations. It actually is requiring us to get at this action, to look on this side of the tree. You have to start playing around with negation. All right. So this is a much more complex task for students. Peirce's law is easy in the two-sided tree system. This is one of those, if you're an experienced instructor of logic, this proof is one of those that separates those with a true mastery of the system from what you might think merely competent. It's one of those hard ones that frustrates individuals. And if you want to do an axiomatic system, that's what the axiomatic proof of Peirce's law looks like, as long as you don't have Peirce's law as one of the axioms. And this is, again, thanks to Jesse Fitz. He is no fan of American football, and so on one Super Bowl day, while everybody else is watching football, he just sat down and did that. All right, well, again, that's all very nice, but what about Peirce? In fact, what about Peirce's own system of logic? And so here is, that's Juliet, but here's Peirce's, a proof of Peirce's law via Peirce's system of permissions via his alpha graphs, okay? And you kind of go, oh, well, that's a notation that is probably unfamiliar with most people. It's really not that hard. In fact, Peirce's system Basically, you start off with a sheet, a blank space, upon which you can inscribe propositions or representations of propositions that you are going to propose to be true. All right? Well, you know, there. That's going to represent a proposition. Okay, snow is white or something. This represents another proposition. And now we've, in effect, represented A and B. But suppose you didn't want to hold B or think of B as true. Now, what if you wanted to think of B as not being true, what would you do? Peirce says, here's what you do. You write it on the back. Okay? But sometimes you might want to look at what's happening on the back. And so you cut a hole in this, in this sort of speak, in the whiteboard here, and you, trust me, flip it around. And that's how you view into the back side of the, now we have the sheet of assertion. This other sheet, what might you think that is? The sheet of denial. Okay? And if you want to, if you want to represent a conditional, okay? Well, here, let me do this again. I sort of did it a different, oh, there we go. Okay, I did something on the back. What did I do on the back? Well, I wrote that on the back. Trust me, I did. Take a look here. So this is what's on the back of the sheet, okay? And this is sort of looking back on the front of the sheet. And if you think under a classical system, Peirce occasionally calls this the scroll. This is saying not A and not B, which on classical logic is A arrow B. Okay? And as you know, we have basically two operations. We have essentially conjunction, which is collocation on the sheet, and we have some kind of negation. Conjunction and negation is expressively powerful enough to express any truth functional compound whatsoever. And then what Peirce does is in the system of permissions, his system of proof basically says, roughly, you can add things that you like onto the sheet of denial, and you can erase things off the sheet of assertion, and then you can also put things that are less embedded, you can copy them into things that are more embedded. And essentially what he's doing is, if you have, for instance, if A then B, what he's saying is, if A then B, well, that means this will follow. If A is sufficient for B, A and C will also be sufficient for B. Okay, that's adding things into the antecedent. And if instead A is sufficient for concluding B and C, well, that means A is sufficient for B alone. And so that is explaining why you may insert things into the sheet of denial, and you may delete things, essentially things represented on the sheet of assertion. All right, so what I've actually pointed out is that there is quite literally, in Peirce's logic, two sides. Okay? Sheet of assertion, sheet of denial on the back. And that what you may do depends on, or what you are permitted to do, the adjustments you are permitted onto these, the adjustments, the modifications you may make to a graph, depends upon what side you are working from. Okay? in fact, actually, this is Peirce himself talking about one way in which you might wish to negative a proposition represented on a graph. Basically what he says is what I just said a while ago. Should a graphist desire to negative a graph, he must scribe it, that is, scribe it on the verso, cut a hole in the graph, that is, draw a circle to give you a view into the back, and flip it around so you can see it, so to speak, from the front. All right, well, philosophically, I find this extraordinarily interesting. These are one of the, I know. The reason I find this extraordinarily interesting is what Peirce is saying here is that the backside, now remember, the backside exists before the cut. You can't have a cut, that is a negation, without having the backside already. Now, what he's saying is that denial is conceptually more primitive than the operation of negation. And this lines up with some very new logical work going under the banner of, well, bilateral logic or rejectivism. And if you, now I know, please turn to your latest, your 1996 issue of Analysis, page 1. You don't need to go far. And you'll see Timothy Smiley saying something like, I treat assertion and rejection as distinct activities on all fours with one another. Whereas assertion expresses assent to a proposition, rejection expresses dissent from it, in each case by means of a sentence whose sense is the proposition in question. One of the things that Smiley is doing is trying to refute a view about negation and its relationship to denial that goes back to Frege. Okay. We don't need to talk about that at all, in fact. The point is that there are logicians, okay? This is the way I like to think of them. Logicians, you will notice from this group of folk, they are all rejectivists. These are folk who all treat, like Peirce did, our understanding of logic as always having a backside, okay, two sides. And if you know these characters, Ian Rumford, Greg Restall, Hugh Price, David Ripley, they all are from down under, but Timothy Smiley is not. And so I always like to think of this as a representation of the most recent bilateralism conference. But then I found out that a bilateralism conference is indeed scheduled, unfortunately not at the University of Woolloomooloo, but instead in Amsterdam, which is perhaps much, much better. And so we have here the new fighting banner, the flag of bilateralism. It's in the calls for papers for this conference in logic. Traditional semantics gives the meaning of expressions in terms of conditions of one kind of primitive. For example, just take a look at the role of a claim the difference it makes to the truth conditions, or just think of the role of assertion in understanding the meaning of a claim. Bilateral approaches hold that the meaning of expressions is characterized in terms of conditions on two, usually opposing primitives, such as truth and falsity, assertion and rejection, belief and disbelief. And there's some advertisement of, oh, bilateralism, this is what it buys for you. Now, one of the very, these are the logicians that I pay attention to. And one of the things that I have found striking about these logicians to whom I pay attention is that Well, it seems as if you listen to them, Frege had it all wrong about assertion and denial, and Timothy Smiley corrected this in 1996. And there is no talk about any historical precursors at all. None. Okay? So my contribution to this conference is, hey, look, if you want some interesting historical precursors, well, you might look to Peirce. In fact, traditional semantics gives the meaning of expressions in terms of conditions on one kind of primitive. Bilateral approaches hold that the meaning of expressions isn't characterized in terms of conditions on two. Here we have Peirce in that 1896 Monist article. Perhaps this is influenced by Royce. For in logic, the medad, now of course that's Peircean vocabulary for a complete proposition. The complete proposition must always be composed of one part having a negative or antecedent character and another part of a positive or consequential character. And if either of these parts is compound, its constituents are similarly related to one another. Now, from what I just said right here, you can see what Peirce means. You have two sides that you need. One of them corresponds to an antecedent character. The other side corresponds to a consequential character. The negative part is the antecedent. The positive part is the consequential. Okay, so you can see here, this is 1896, is where he is developing some of his very first versions of his graphical logic. He called them the entitative graphs. They are a variant of his more mature work here, the existential graphs. All right, well, I've talked to you about Peirce's bilateralism. I've talked to you, I've talked to you about bilateralism, Peirce's bilateral system. But here's the interesting thing. Remember, I offered you a bilateral system of propositional logic as well. And it turns out you can embed Peirce's notation just fine in the system of two-sided trees. In fact, what's going on here, Peirce's logic basically had you view the graphs from the sheet of assertion, and if necessary, you cut holes to view the sheet of denial. And you might need to cut further holes to flip back and forth and all that. What this is doing, what the two-sided trees is doing, is saying, okay, we're going to turn this onto its side. You've got the sheet of assertion. Was that the sheet of assertion? By the way, I did have the A and B over here. Sheet of assertion on this side, the sheet of denial on this side. That's what you are looking at right here. And what you are looking at, by the way, are choices that Peirce describes in one of his more colorful descriptions of semantics. He describes, hey, how do you know whether a given, in this case, graph is true or false? Well, imagine a game being played by somebody working on this side, somebody working on this side, and what's going on here is this is a refuser, what sometimes he calls nature or the graphemus. If nature can win, that is, if nature has a winning strategy, that means the graph that the graphist produced, which you might think of as either a proposed truth or a proposed argument, doesn't work. And so we have here, essentially, we have here a diagram of the space of possibilities that Peirce's game can go. if you might have noticed, by the way, that this has more operations than the tree proof that I gave you. And that's just a feature of, we are looking here we are looking at these graphs as if they are just negations and conjunctions. You can actually fix that. If you look at the graphs, here we're looking this as a conjunction, as a conditional, and here as a disjunct, and they come out much, much cleaner. And in fact, this recapitulates Peirce's own reasoning for Peirce's law in 1885. All right, again, the question might arise. Okay, well, that's all very fine. That's a lot of the graphs and so on. But you, Dave, in your title, you said something about the pragmatic maxim. Well, here it comes. Turns out that one of the primary uses to which Peirce wanted to apply that pragmatic maxim is to give, apply the existential graphs, is to give a proof or some sort of demonstration. I don't think it was a deductive proof. Demonstration of the pragmatic maxim, which he considers to be the one contribution of value that he has to make a philosophy. Yeah, just one. It's a proof of the pragmatic maxim via the existential graphs. Okay, that's all you need to know. All you need to worry about with proof with Peirce. And here's basically, so this is at the beginning of the monist series of 1905, 1906. This is later on in that same series. And he says, I beg leave, reader, as an introduction to my defense of pragmatism, to the pragmatic maxim, to bring before you a very simple system of diagrammatization of propositions, which I termed the system of existential graphs. Basically, at least in the propositional level, what I just showed you here. Okay? And he says, he goes on to tell us in that article that he believes that diagrammatic reasoning is indeed the only fertile kind of reasoning, and if only logicians would really embrace diagrams, logical diagrams such as these, we should no longer see attempts to base their science on the fragile foundations of metaphysics or a psychology not based on logical theory. In other words, look to the graphs to resist psychologism. Look to the graphs to resist metaphysical flights of fancy or flights of fancy that might not pass muster via the pragmatic maxim. And in a late letter to Paul Peirce, it turns out that Peirce never delivers on his proof of the pragmatic maxim. It's left as kind of a frustrating exercise for his commentators ever since. In 1908, 1909, very late in Peirce's career, he once again says, hey, Paul, the editor of The Monist, let me offer you the proof of pragmatism again. I've been holding back for half a dozen years. I'm not going to change my mind or my notation this time. Okay? And I can get it ready for you. It consists in showing what logical analysis or real definition consists in, and how existential graphs can be used to aid the operation, and how one is to distinguish an elementary from a composite idea with illustrations of the working of it. In other words, you get kind of a sense of what Peirce was thinking about, or how that proof was supposed to go. You are supposed to see in some sense, see a demonstration of the pragmatic maxim in the operations of the existential graphs for him. But I would argue that you can see the pragmatic maxim, perhaps give some kind of demonstration of it, but you can see the pragmatic maxim in operation in the system of two-sided trees with which I started started out this lecture. And so I'm going to call your attention here to a couple of articulations of the pragmatic maxim that are bilateral in the way precisely that those bilateralists about logic would love. Of course, they don't know this. We'll bring that to their attention in June. The first bilateral expression of the pragmatic maxim, as far as I can see, is in this book right here, the Baldwin Dictionary of Philosophy and Psychology. And it's actually not Peirce's. It's William James. It's in the collected papers of Peirce because William James gave this definition to Peirce for his definition of the pragmatic. And James here supplies as his definition of pragmatism the doctrine that the whole meaning of a conception expresses itself in practical consequences, consequences either in the shape of conduct to be recommended or in that of experiences to be expected. Comment, by the way, Peirce hated this bit, or in experiences to be expected, of the conception, if true, which consequences would be different if untrue. In other words, what James is doing builds in an awful lot in that articulation of the pragmatic maxim. But one of the things you need to look at are the consequences of a conception, if true. And you also need to look at the consequences of a conception, if not true. Okay? This is Peirce, following very shortly upon James's articulation here. And of course, Peirce was very well aware of this definition. Okay, he comments on it in the same encyclopedia entry. All right. He says in a manuscript which looks like it's an attempt to get at an early manuscript of his monist articles from 1905, he says, in order to ascertain the meanings of an intellectual conception, one should consider what practical consequences might conceivably result by necessity from the truth of that conception, and the sum of these consequences will constitute the entire meaning of the conception. Now notice, falsity doesn't appear here. This is a unilateral articulation of the pragmatic maxim. But this is the manuscript, and here's how it comes out in the published version, in the monist of issue of 1905. Endeavoring as a man of that type, of course he's talking about himself in the third person. Okay. Endeavoring as a man of that type naturally would to formulate what he so approved, the pragmatic maxim. He framed the theory that a conception, that is the rational purport of a word or other expression, lies exclusively in its conceivable bearing on the conduct of life. We got that. So since obviously nothing that might not result from experiment can have direct bearing on the conduct, if one can define accurately all the conceivable experimental phenomena, and now we've got a bilateral articulation of the pragmatic maxim. Affirmation, and we also include denial. In other words, we have this side, and of course, we have this side as well. And in case you think this is an isolated expression, here we have something very similar from 1904. I mentioned this. It's in the Menand Pragmatism Reader. I mentioned that because that was a reader that I used teaching an American philosophy course. And a very sharp student of mine who is taking American philosophy and the method of trees that I deploy, he kind of takes a look at this and he goes, the method prescribed in the maxim is to trace out in the imagination the conceivable practical consequences, that is, for deliberate self-controlled conduct, of the affirmation or denial of the concept. And the assertion of the maxim is that herein lies the whole purport of the word, the entire concept. I'll talk about this next bit in a little bit. But what my student Tim Connolly says, these are trees, right? These are the two-sided trees that you're talking about. And basically, that comment was, in many respects, the inspiration for my taking a look at the classical pragmatists trying to mine out bilateral expressions of the maxim. And yes, indeed, that's he sort of hit me over the head that yes, Tim was right. This is a bilateral expression. It connects to his work on the existential graphs, both sides, and it's also, I think, illustrated even more directly in the method of bilateral trees. By the way, I love this passage. It's not as well known, of course, as the monist passage, but he also mentions the sedulous exclusion from this statement of all reference to sensation is specially to be remarked. And that especially if you concentrate on very early expressions of the pragmatic maxim, sensation figures prominently, and he seems to be backing off of this. And I think part of the reason there is that he is trying to get the purport of the pragmatic maxim, trying to get the purport of the pragmatic maxim to be contained entirely within his graphical system. Affirmation and denial, why not belief and disbelief? Again, I think what he's on about there is he's trying to get away from psychologism. And so the pragmatic maxim is to be understood not so much in terms of belief and disbelief, but rather what the operations that may be performed on a diagram such as this, on the sheet of assertion and the sheet of denial. All right. This actually is close to my very last slide. This is one of those, let's step back and take a look at at the ground that we've covered. I actually think that the existential graphs and also the method of bilateral trees asks us to reconceive the very central notions of logic. Okay, what gives logic its lifeblood? What animates it? It's the notion of entailment. There's a phenomena. Okay, there's a phenomena that in some sense is out there or with us. And that is, in our language, or in our speech acts at least, certain acts follow from certain others. Okay? Certain claims, you might say, follow from others. And logic, it's a phenomenon you can't but help observe. But it's a phenomenon that you might want to understand. How is it possible that certain, or how am I best to understand this following relationship? Now, those of you who took logic, or maybe even are teaching logic, okay? Think now of entailment. Think in terms of the validity of an argument. Entailment is a little bit broader than argument validity. But think about the definition of validity that you give to your students, or that you might have heard in a class. Okay? An argument is valid if the truth of premises guarantees the truth. The truth of premises guarantees the truth of a conclusion. Okay? That's actually a conception that is mapped out very well in a Fitch-style natural deduction calculus. Okay? Start with the truth of premises, and you work out, kind of step by step. You might want to work from the bottom a little bit to see where it is you're going to go, but it's truth-preserving rules of inference. This is the conception of validity that you would catch from the one-sided trees of Richard Jefferies. It is now impossible for the premises and the negation of the conclusion all to be true at once. Okay? Again, very one-sided. here is one reading of, it's a bilateral reading of validity that you can gain from the trees. It is impossible for the latter to be true and the former to be, that is the premises, all to be true, and the conclusion to be, now if you're James, remember he said untrue, and on assumptions of classical logic, that's equivalent to false. So think of this as a Jamesian conception now of validity applied to the two-sided trees. This is now, when he talks, he doesn't talk about truth and falsity. In fact, this side is the sheet of assertion. The versed side is the sheet of denial. And so now you are shifting from possibility to impermissibility. So the conception of validity that is invited by Peirce's understanding of his bilateral logic, or you can think of a Peircean understanding of the two-sided trees, now is not in terms of possibility, but in terms of permissibility. Okay? What validity was once, what was once understood in an alethic modality key is now understood in terms of deontic rules. It's in terms of rules. So we have, it's impermissible to affirm the latter and to deny the former. And I would argue actually that you should even go further. Don't understand validity or invalidity in terms of possibilities or impossibility. Instead, understand it in terms of permissibilities now to accept and to reject. So what makes an argument valid? It is impermissible to accept premises while rejecting a conclusion. Now, why is that at all interesting? Well, among other things, here's a real quick case. Think of now imperative logic. Imperative logic, imperatives don't bear truth values. Okay? So either close the door or turn off the heat. You might have heard that before, or something like that. Okay? What do you live in a barn? Right? And then you might hear, don't you dare turn off the heat. Could be from another source, by the way. Okay? How do you register acceptance of these imperatives? Okay? And so accepting both of these, okay, you may not reject this imperative then. Acceptance of this precludes the rejection of this. I say, damn it, close the door, because I was trying to find, I believe that there is a slight place in Peirce where he uses as an example of the pragmatic maxim differences in the expressions of how to levy imperatives. I couldn't find it. But this is what you might think of as imperative disjunctive syllogism. This is a case of imperative monus ponens. And you can figure out this. Any language using, any competent language user here can figure this out. And the point actually is, if these are, one of the things you might like for economy's sake is you might like this either or to be the same either or that your regular disjunctive syllogism is. And you might like this if then to be the same conditional that you couch your regular indicative sentence arguments in a standard logic in. So in order to keep the meaning of or and if to apply to these cases as well, as I think you should, then you should head away from you should head away from notions of validity in terms of truth and falsity, and cast your understanding of logic into this deontic key. In other words, logic really is a normative science. It is a science of permissions. and not so much possibilities. And I'm going to close on that. I had for Larry's benefit, I had an expression from Experience in Nature, which I do think to be Dewey's best book, where he says something that sounds a little bit like what I just said, and that's it. Here are, if you want to check up on me, here's the homework that I did for this. Thank you. And now I suppose the bullets start flying.
You want to handle your own kind of questions?
Or I will do so.
Yeah, okay. So, first of all, that was awesome, I have to say.
That's not a bullet.
No, not yet. I don't think I have bullets. I'm not sure what I have, but I really enjoyed that. That was great. Just since nobody else is talking, I'll fill the void a little bit. This is a thought that sparked right near the end when you're talking about logic as sort of a deontic or a normative sort of process, and you're talking about thinking of these like Peirce's system of graphs in terms of like acceptance, rejections, beliefs, and these kinds of things. Do you think that there's a connection here or a way of, this is such an inchoate thought, so I apologize for this, but
it's our group responsibility to
bring
it full
that
flower.
Makes me want to re-examine the fixations of belief in light of this kind of dual-sided system and see if there's something there. Like, is this in Peirce's mind when he's thinking of the fixations of belief, right? And then, like, can we, I don't know, does that make any sense? Like, is there a tie between these things? Is there a way that we could articulate the fixations of belief on, like, this, by, like, the system that you've described here, or?
Well, Peirce certainly thought something of this sort, because these letters to Paul Peirce that I mentioned at the very end, those were meant as his advertisement for, hey, I would like to republish the illustrations of the logic of science, the fixation of belief.
Yep.
And so your question, in one sense, is, can you find these thoughts in the fixation of belief in inchoate forms? But I really do have to do digging. There are reasons that the passages that I pulled out were not from that time period.
Right.
Okay, so I would have to do some interpretive maneuvers
Right.
to get at what Peirce said in 1878 and 1879. On the other hand, there are reasons to think that Peirce thought that he could get
I guess all I'm asking is, if you do that work, I'd like to see it, because it seems like there should be something there, right? That there's an overlap between those insights.
I will say, upon rereading, in fact, I read the Case de Wall's his reprint of the illustrations of the logic of science. I did that, by the way, here at the Institute. Thank you, guys. I did that here. So I was reading those essays again with a nose, pointed right at these kinds of things, and I really didn't find any smoking guns. I found plenty in the footnotes that Wall put. Yeah, but not in the direct texts from 1878, 1879. But again, I think that in this, especially since he wants to, as part of the reprint of the illustrations of the logic of science, he wants the existential graphs to be there and to do work. By the way, Paul Peirce was not having anything of the sort. It's like, no.
Because that's what it would take to be a normative sort of science in this sense, right? Or something like this.
Well, that's what.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
what. That's my understanding of when Peirce talks about the only fertile reasoning is diagrammatic reasoning,
Right.
and what you can. Logic should be seen as playing with and reading what lessons can be learned off the graphs. I had another thought, by the way. It's not my thought. For participating in a conference on creativity, I'm a most uncreative person, so this is not my thought. In giving a lecture that covered much of this ground up at a sister institution up north, Jim Livengood, a Peircean at the University of Illinois, basically said, boy, some of what you're saying about bilateralism, I think, can be discerned in the 1868 Journal of Speculative Philosophy papers. And I've read those several times, but I haven't read them with such laser-eyed focus on the bilateralism. And I would not be surprised if you might be able to find something out of that. By the way, JSP, perhaps under its in order to get by its editorial board, that JSP series is much more Hegelian than what you catch in the 1878. And I would argue that the bilateralism, if you really want to make this pop, if you really want to reify this, this is the world. Over here, that's the topsy-turvy world. This is Hegel's topsy-turvy world right here. Stranger things be there. Makes you wonder when you start cutting holes in it, what happens. But I would not be surprised to extend your question, not just the fixation of belief, but also the earlier. And I haven't done that work. I need a couple of extra months here. I get Myron, and then I have Larry.
So thank you very much. It was an excellent paper. I thought this was, so to me, a good paper provokes thought. And I was sitting here thinking the whole time they were talking that Peirce seems to me, tell me if I'm wrong, talk me away from jumping over the ledge, but it seems to me that Peirce is giving the foundations for either a prisoner's dilemma or game theory, and not in a zero-sum way. Is there any way you can elaborate on that? If you're familiar with, so I'm thinking of my social science friends and how this may be a foundation that's more conducive to non-zero-sum game theory. So are you familiar with this literature?
Probably. I'm familiar with the old literature on that.
Back from it definitely has advanced.
From an undergraduate.
But that kind of bilateralism, it seems he clearly tries to demarcate all of the possibilities or what is permissible and impermissible. Right, as you were talking about, in terms of all of the, in terms of the, when you turn the board sideways and to be able to see it from all sides and all angles, that seems to be what the prisoner's dilemma is trying to get at. Now, I know the prisoner's dilemma is a zero-sum, but I believe this can be incorporated into a non-zero-sum kind of logic.
Well, I don't quite know what to make of the prisoner's dilemma, but there has been work on what are alternately called game theory semantics or dialogic logic, dialogical semantics.
Okay.
And when I was talking about Richard Birch reconstructed some of Peirce's manuscripts where he described his semantics in terms of a dialogue between a skeptic and a non-skeptic, and it's sort of as the rules of the game that they can play. Now, in his endoperutic game, there's one winner. It's one or the other. So in that sense, it's
zero
very
sum.
it's very non-zero sum. But there have been fruitful attempts to map Peirce's use of the graphs to dialogic logic or game theoretic semantics. I honestly don't know what to make of your prisoner's dilemma side of the question. So instead of dancing about that any further, I'm going to turn to Larry.
I just had two comments and a question. First comment is, I wish you'd been around when I was teaching logic in the 70s and 80s, because my students would have been much happier, I think, and I would have too.
I will say,
I taught Soupy's logic, and it was terrible.
I've worked. It's part of the situation that I am in at UNLV. It's a somewhat distinct situation. We have a lot of us. We have to teach in formal logic as opposed to the informal reasoning and critical thinking class. We have to do that too, but we have to teach a lot of formal logic, and we have to teach it to our majors and all of the computer science students. And if you know where student demographics are going, computer science students are mushrooming, and so we have to. We have had to learn how to teach large numbers of students and get effective results out of them. If you don't, that was a comment I know, but if you let me to amplify that, at my home institution, UNLV, these are good students, they are dedicated students, but they are not the Stanford or the MIT students. We get extremely frustrated by approaches to logical pedagogy that have ossified, since there are still people that use that Soupy's book.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that.
Well, I'm angry. And this is kind of as part of a creativity conference. You might wonder why the teaching of, you might turn around in your mind, why the teaching of logic, why logical pedagogy has ossified to the extent that I think it has.
It's not regarded at the undergraduate level as a creative enterprise.
What? Let's play around with diagrams. There's nothing more fun than that. All right. So
the second comment is, I'm amazed that Hugh Price doesn't already know this. I mean, he drives a big bus around Australia with the pragmatic bus. I mean, and he must read Peirce. Why in the world doesn't he already know this? You don't have to answer that. You're going to find out. But the question is. At first glance, Dewey's a real outlier here. I mean, he's doing something completely different. On second glance, however,
all right, this is what I want to hear.
He denies that propositions are true or false, and the way he puts it is they are valid or invalid, which sounds a lot like acceptable or unacceptable.
Yep.
And so that it is judgments that are true or false. It's propositions that are valid or invalid. Because a proposition is a proposal, and you either accept it or you don't, as in marriage. Dewey even uses the example of the pitcher and the batter.
What?
The pitcher makes a proposition to the batter. The batter swings and makes a proposition to the infielder outfield, and the outfielder makes a proposition to home plate. Right? He didn't go quite that far. But
nice.
In all of this, there are intermediate judgments. The batter's making a judgment, which turns into
as distinct from a proposition.
A judgment, of course. Intermediate judgments, and the judgment of the batter can be true or false, but the proposition to him is neither true nor false. It is a proposal. Sounds a lot like what you're doing.
Well, it's So
Or
he's
a question, maybe the better thing is, I should ask you, is it similar to what you're doing?
I am not going to. That's going to demand that I know the Dewey in question, and I'm going to defer to the Dewey experts. But I want to. In fact, one of the other things that I still have yet and want to get from my residency here at the AIPCT is to. Well, I want my homework for when I return back to my home institution. And Dewey's logic is certainly on the homework if it's not required reading for the next week. Good enough. There was one other, it fled my mind like a bird.
So the slide you have on the board right now is a good point of departure for the question that
This
I
is
have.
a Risby, by the way.
Yeah, yes. No, that's not what I was thinking about. I'm thinking about the right side of your bilateral tree. One of the things that I don't think your tree captures is that each one of those cuts is operating at a different level of generality. In other words, when you enter the first cut, it's true that you enter the positive version of that proposition on the verso. But when you enter a second cut, the reintroduction of what was originally cut is at a different level of generality. Exactly. So the reintroduction, so you can't eliminate these cuts because when A emerges on the other side, it's not the A that you asserted.
Did I eliminate these cuts?
Well, no. What I'm saying is that I didn't mean eliminate. That's not the right word. What I mean is the reintroduction of A into the space of assertion through the use of a second cut. The reintroduction of A cannot be the A that went on to the verso. And the reason is that each one of those circles, let's just start with the negation of your conclusion. The negation of your conclusion there has a cut for every term.
This is not a negation. This is a denial.
The denial of your conclusion, and actually I like that because denial is a great word for the most generalized negation, right? But the trouble is, and this actually
denial. Okay, so maybe I'll head off something or not.
Okay, yeah.
I'm not.
But I haven't gotten to my point. But go ahead.
Boy, if I want to do the old style philosophy of language things, these are forces here. We have assertion and denial. As Ati-Viikko Pitarainen and some of his co-write authors point out, the cut is it's actually only secondarily a negation. If you look at the Peirce, maybe I can.
Well, it's isolation. You isolate your assertion.
That's right. It's
separated from the plane of assertion.
This is the cut operates perhaps even most fundamentally as it's creating a topological space.
It's a space of assertion.
Yes.
But it's a plane of assertion until you assert something. At which point it starts becoming a much more complex space.
You are, one way of putting that is, let's see, this is the odd, this is the even side. Mm-hmm. This is not being asserted or denied. It's just, as you might have said, it's just a plane.
Well,
it's embedded.
And I think this is a problem. And the reason is I think that this is an intensive form of reasoning, which is to say you drag along with you everything you asserted all along the way. I'm sure Bob Birch would agree with me. This operates on a Kantian reflective logic, which is intensive, and it means that it's non-monotonic, which you're treating it as monotonic. Or maybe you aren't, but here is the term that I would use. I would say you operationalized Peirce by making it monotonic, and it isn't. And so it's a functional logic, and its functionality is not operational logic, but a functional logic. That's what makes it normative. In other words, this is more than just a representation of thinking, which is what you've made it. This is not a representation of thinking. This is actual thinking. And you've turned it into an operation as opposed to a function. And so you've rendered it non-normative. You flattened it. You squashed that sucker flat. Everything that was intensively valuable about the process of rising. So each one of those A's not only has had a journey, a different journey to the verso, right, to the dark side, or to stranger things. They've had different,
actually, you can.
They've had different journeys, but they also don't mean the same thing.
That's the point of the tree, though, right?
Well, no, no.
Yeah, each of the A's have very, in Peirce's in the proof using Peirce's permission. Yeah. Each of the A's have different journeys to get there. That's right.
I know that, but my question, no. So, but here's the thing: the tree, your tree, the tree with the Peirce diagram, that's not the same as your tree. This tree is much more interesting than your tree.
Okay. I'm actually quite.
There's more here than you're allowing, is what I'm saying.
So no. You are suggesting that I am wed to this notation.
Mm-hmm.
I am not wed to this notation. I am wed.
Well, why do you use it? You said here's my tree method.
Because
you can learn this in an hour.
It is. You can.
So
in the standard notation. But I'm not wed to this notation.
Well, Klein taught me that the notation is pretty much the whole deal. You don't like Klein, but I do. And so what I would say is that the notation that you're using to teach your students is not normative logic. This would be normative logic if you explained to them that it's non-monotonic, and that's why each of the A's is actually a different A.
Guess what?
Yeah.
That's what I do.
How do you do that with that other?
It's that. I do this in my.
You do this
in my second logic class.
So I don't think you can learn logic. I don't think you can learn your tree method in an hour.
Oh. Not with
because I don't think you can learn this. I don't think you can learn this in an hour.
Not with this notation. With the other notation, I can.
What are you really teaching them then? You're not
just how to get started.
I mean, this would be the real thing.
So
so let me revise my question, which is really just a complete attack.
There's another thing.
Revise the question. Either you don't smash it flat and you make the points you've just made, or you smash it flat and teach it to them in an hour.
I can teach using the standard notation. I can teach it in a half an hour. But that's not the subject. That's a subject of a first class. A second class is more like this.
And by the way, A is not A. Is that your first sentence?
A is not A.
Yeah, A equals A is not a law of my logic. So we start out by denying the principle of identity. Now let's do it.
I generally don't teach. I generally don't teach identity.
You would have to leave it out, but that's why I say you're operationalizing it rather than making it a functional logic. Because A isn't A.
So the question is...
I think A now, I think A 3 seconds from now. It's not the same thought. All right, sorry. Go.
So are you asking me to embed the lines of identity?
I think that you should make it really, really clear to your students that A is not A. That you deny simple identity or simple location, or that you deny the identity of A with A, not because A isn't A, but because in order to say A twice means you can't prove A once and then plug it in on a lower line of your proof. I'm sorry. It doesn't work. That's not how we really think. We don't. You can squash everything into two-dimensional non-thought and pretend that we think monotonically, but we don't.
So, gosh, there's a couple of things in here. There are extensions of this. These are hard.
Not
to
in
give
an
these,
hour, okay.
yeah, not in an hour, to give formal non-monotonic logics out of this. Again, not in an hour. You can actually see some of that in that Rorty chapter that I wrote for you.
I didn't accuse you of believing in monotonic logic. I accused you of using notation in order to squash what you in fact know. And the fact that you know it is clear from this diagram. You know that A is not A.
I know that there are two A's there.
Well, that's
or
what,
three
that's
A's.
what I really mean.
Yeah,
or lots of
yeah,
A's.
lots of A's.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Randy, like, when you made the comment about the different levels of generality, I mean, isn't that the point of the tree? That it's stratifying different levels of generality of each of these terms? Or?
This tree, yes. The other
But
tree,
no.
I don't think so.
Actually, yeah. I mean, if I want to fight back on this,
Yeah.
So
I do think that you saying this is hardly axiomatical is helpful.
This X and this X, are they the same X?
No.
Yeah.
They can't be, but they,
so
look,
it's not monotonic.
they look like the same X in your notation system. They surely do.
No,
You
one's
get
over
that
here.
impression.
The one's over here.
Wow.
Oh,
come on.
You know.
Come on. You can't.
Well,
You
this
can't
isn't
expect
mathematics.
anyone to be able to
It's
see
logic.
that.
Those are two different X's.
Those are two different X's.
That sure looks like monotonicity.
Well,
And by the way, that X down there, that's the same X too.
it's actually the monotonicity arises from the specific rules that I articulated.
What I will give you is that the X's on the left side are not the same as the X's on the right side. But if I follow the right side down, man, that's monotonic thinking.
Okay.
You're misleading your students. You tell them you're teaching normative
Non-monotonic.
logic, and in fact, it's only operational.
I don't know.
Well, did he claim to teach them normative logic? I don't remember.
I did claim
I think
that.
you claimed.
I did claim that.
I remember you claiming that you taught this method in half an hour or an hour. But
that method.
that's right.
But I did claim that logic is a normative science.
And you
And
teach
so
your
if
students
that means normative logic,
Do you teach your students that?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I believe that.
That's basically what I would.
One thing you could do to rescue this is you could point out that that your braces, brackets, and parentheses, well, you don't have braces and parentheses there, but that your braces and parentheses represent different levels of generality. That's still not going to save you, because the trouble is they're actually very strong forms of denial.
Let's.
If it were Peirce's graphs, those are very strong denials.
I'm going to bristle at your notion of denial here, because now you're embedding. If denial is being, if the braces and the brackets are representing denials, I'm going to bristle at that, because you don't have embedded denials. You can't have embedded negations.
Okay. You save the word denial for the most general situation. Okay, well that's fine. But yeah, negation then. But they're negations at different levels of generality.
So now let's not talk about the arrow here. The arrow.
The arrow involves a negation as well.
Yeah, the arrow. But if I have just the conjunctions and the disjunctions, especially conjunctions on this side and disjunctions on this side.
Yeah.
The brackets do. The brackets are forming an assorting function that could just as well, actually. Don't think about the arrow, but think of these as conjunction disjunctions. think of these now as Peirce did when he was developing the cut. Is he was thinking of conjunctions being affirmed and basically disjunctions being denied, and the cut was meant as as sort of a grouping operation.
That's the 1898 cut, yes.
The 1898. I'm thinking of a paper now, a very recent paper by Peirce, where he traces that cut from...
The cut has a long history, and it changes
history.
meanings through his thought, but I'm more or less taking it from the fully developed existential graphs stage, which is what everything you're doing is really after 1902. I mean,
the settled stuff.
The fully developed stuff, yeah. And so the existential graphs were coming for a long time, but the fully developed system is about 1902, and so anyway. But granting that the idea of the cut has a history in Peirce, it's still this notation system does not express the same proof, if you even want to call it a proof. You probably do, as your rather nice bilateral expression of Peirce's law. I think Peirce would look at this and just shake his head.
I
never said that.
I will agree with you. He never said that.
Right.
He would dash to the board and start fixing it.
And I am using the notion of proof and the notion of logical entailment in a very psychologically psychologically drained way. So when I think about
so it's not supposed to have anything to do with how we actually think.
No.
Actually, I guess that's my complaint.
And I'm not really surprised.
Okay, yeah.
Logic isn't giving the laws of thought, or actually, here's one way of putting it: logic isn't giving the laws of thinking.
Well, there are any laws of thinking, but yeah.
But it is giving, shall we say, an explanation of the entailment relation between claims.
That's nominalism.
Nominal.
That is not Peirce.
Well,
that is why he would walk up and say, "I never said this."
Well, again, he never said this, but.
And what did he say in that letter to Peirce? He says, "I'm never going to be able to do this without nominalism," which you would say, "Yep, that's right, Peirce."
That is on the list of quotes where I'm going.
Where you go.
Okay, yeah. So the the nominalistic underbelly behind all of this.
Because you sucked into the individual.
And I probably will stand guilty and admit guilt here.
I didn't realize that was actually my complaint, but I guess it is.
That might be your complaint. This is the Peirce as read by somebody who read a whole heck of a lot of Sellers.
Well, if it works, I mean, it's funny you end up at James on this. If it works, then surely it's a good thing, I would say, especially if it helps with the pedagogy. On the other hand, as a reading of Peirce, or actually an operationalizing of Peirce, it's a bit contrary to his spirit, but not necessarily something. I mean, obviously it can be done. You're doing it. So anyway, well.
Yeah,
thank you guys for enduring that tirade or diatribe.
Oh well, no. I mean, if we're done, we're done.
Let's talk over beers and whatnot. Thank you, Dave.